Okay, today I am delighted to be speaking with Pablo Roman from the Dreaming Spanish channel. Pablo, welcome to the show.
Thanks for inviting me to your channel.
Good to be talking to you. So what are we going to be talking about today?
So today we're going to talk about comprehensible input and why it's so important when learning a language.
Comprehensible input, great. I've heard that before somewhere. I'm going to enjoy talking about this.
I think you've heard. I think you've made even some video
Yeah,
about comprehensible
maybe
input.
once or twice. Okay, so this is going to be a two-part conversation. This here on my channel in English, and then we're going to record a conversation in Spanish on Pablo's channel, which is called Dreaming Spanish, and that's going to be all about my experiences learning Spanish and what I've enjoyed about Spanish and Spain and Argentina and the whole Spanish-speaking world. So to see that conversation, there's going to be a link in the description below, so you can click that and find Pablo's channel where you can see just how badly I massacre Spanish on the day that we were recording. So
He did
Pablo,
well. He did very well.
yeah, we already recorded it, so it was very early in the morning. So Pablo, I know that you are a big fan of comprehensible input. So maybe we could begin by you telling us a little bit about what you understand comprehensible input to be, and why you think it's such a valuable way to approach language learning.
Okay, so the comprehensible input hypothesis basically says that we acquire language when we understand messages. And so the idea of that is that you need to listen to the language, you need to possibly read the language and relate that somehow to reality to be able to really acquire the language. And an important concept to understand comprehensible input is the distinction between learning and acquisition. I guess you're familiar with this distinction, right?
Yeah, but let's lay it out so that it's clear. So we've got learning and acquisition. So what do you understand those to be?
So learning would be explicitly studying grammar rules. So knowing what rule you have to apply, when you have to use the third person s, or where you have to use the plural, etc. But when you really acquire that rule, you're applying it unconsciously, you're speaking and using it without having to think in terms of rules. And it's basically what happens in every native speaker. Most of the rules that we apply on a daily basis when having a conversation, we haven't been taught in school. And usually when we go to school and we start learning grammar, we're basically already fluent in our native language. So we don't really need to study the grammar to be able to use it. And what comprehensible input says is that even when you grow up and you become an adult, you can still learn that way by simply getting input the same way that children do. And this learning applies both to grammar rules and to studying vocabulary, as into trying to memorize vocabulary as translations of, for example, from English to Spanish if you're learning Spanish. While with acquisition, what you would do is implicitly connect the meaning of those words and the way they're used, so the grammar, by receiving lots and lots of input. And this image of the grammar and the meaning of the vocabulary gradually develops in your head, and you become able to have a conversation spontaneously without having to think about grammar, without having to translate in your head.
So just to kind of summarize what you've said, then the idea is that because most people, when they think about language learning, they think about the words and the grammar, maybe the pronunciation too, but that's a slightly different area. So the idea here, what we're saying is that yes, you need to learn words and you need to learn grammar, but the best way to do that is not by memorizing and studying them, but rather to read and listen to real material in the language and to learn that way. And this can be quite counterintuitive to people, because most people have the experience of learning languages at school, which is all about memorizing lists of words and studying grammar rules. So what do you say to people who ask you the very understandable question, which is, well, how can you learn the language if you're not studying it? How do you know what the words mean? How do you know how the grammar works if you don't study it?
The way you know what words mean, for example, is that this input that you're receiving needs to be comprehensible, and this is why it's called comprehensible input. So it needs to be just slightly above your level. And this just means that you need to already be able to understand most things that are being said. When you're really starting from zero, then things need to be very evident. Like what people are saying needs to refer exactly to things that you're seeing in front of you. So this would be very similar to when babies receive, when their parents talk to them. They talk to them about the apples and the chair and things that they're seeing. And so in my channel where I teach Spanish, I do that. I have this level to start from zero that I call super beginner. And everything is visual, everything that I'm telling, there's something there to make you understand what's being said. Even if you knew zero Spanish, you would understand what's going on. At higher levels, what that comprehensible means, it means that you need to already understand most of the words that are being used, so that new words are easy to guess just from context.
Yeah, at the higher levels, it's kind of when it's kind of easier to understand in a way, right? Because then you can already read, so to make it really simple, you could say, right, well, let's say you can understand intermediate Spanish. Well, then you should read something at upper intermediate Spanish, and then you can kind of ratchet yourself up step by step. But what is the harder bit, well, certainly what I get questions about a lot is, well, look, how does this work as a beginner? Because I'd like to read your books of stories, Ollie, but I don't understand anything yet. So what do I do as a beginner? So I know you deal with this on your channel where you teach Spanish. So how do you, if you have a student, or you're teaching somebody or creating videos for somebody who's a real beginner in Spanish, how do you apply the comprehensible input idea to what you do?
So I use a number of techniques to make things easier to understand. I make gestures, I make like noises, like animal noises if I'm talking about an animal. I make drawings, so I have a setup with 2 cameras, so I can record myself drawing on a whiteboard on my desk. And then I have sheets that show like different vegetables and fruits, and a calendar and the seasons and stuff, so that I can use those to convey meaning. And for the idea for somebody who's just starting is, imagine that you recorded this video and you didn't say anything in the whole video. How would you make them understand it anyway? So maybe you've seen it. There's a number of cartoons where the characters don't really talk, but they're moving around, they're doing stuff, and you understand what's going on. So it would be something similar to that.
So are you? Let me dig down even deeper to that. So at the very beginning levels, then you're doing things like showing an object. So I imagine that you can say mug or cup, and that kind of works. But I guess that you're not just using single words. I guess that you're also talking at the same time in order to kind of pad that out. So say some more about what role the teacher has to play here, because I suspect it's a very big role.
So yeah, I would say that it's not enough to just relate a word with an object, because that's something that you could have, I don't know, just a website with pictures and you click on them and you hear a word. But to keep the student engaged, to keep them paying attention and to keep them coming, like not getting very bored, and to keep them coming back tomorrow, it needs to be somehow engaging. I think it's important to keep the language meaningful, to use the language for a communicative purpose, trying to do something that the person would be doing anyway, even if they were not trying to learn a language. So something that people like doing is, I don't know, watching humor videos, for example. So try to make it humorous. Try to tell a story about yourself, something just interesting, something that would be interesting beyond trying to learn a language.
Because you mentioned the problem of having kind of single words, almost like flashcards. I mean, that has always seemed to me to be how most language apps work, especially apps that kind of have that offer lots of different languages. They're essentially kind of using algorithms to create these kind of random flashcards where you've got a picture on one side and a word on the other. You've got to ask the question: well, what else can the learner be exposed to during this time? And this is where, like, I think the role of the teacher is so important, and the teacher really has the power to make or break an experience for the students, depending on how they how they manage that learning experience. So, are you familiar with any of the more kind of established methods which use comprehensible input as a base, like TPRS and things like that, or have you kind of developed your own method from scratch?
The method that I use is based mostly on a method that's used in a school here where I'm living in Bangkok. They use it to teach Thai, and it was developed by Dr. Martin Brown. He learned about Stephen Krashen's theories back in the, I think, 70s or early 80s, and then he developed his own version. And nowadays there are a couple, depending how you count them, like 2 or 3 more ways of applying comprehensible input in the classroom that are used mostly in middle schools and high schools in the US. But my method is based mostly on the method used here in this school in Thailand, which I attended. I attended it for 1 year just to prove myself that
really?
The method works. And what I've done mostly is just adapt this method to a video format.
How was that experience, by the way, at the school? Was it intense?
It was fun. It was a lot of fun. You're like in a theater, you're like attending a play, and the teachers are just being silly and funny, and it was amazing. It was
so
awesome.
Is it total immersion, or how does it
So
work?
they only speak Thai. The idea is that they're gonna be 100% of the time speaking Thai, and they do have whiteboards, so they'll try to make things easy to understand. And also, one particular thing about this method, and then that I also try to follow in my channel, is to not force output. And yeah, so in this school, there's still some interaction. So the teacher sometimes asks you questions, but you're supposed to either answer with a gesture if you can, or just answer in English.
One of the things I wonder in this environment is it so you're talking about a very interactive environment, right, where you've got students and you've got teachers, and the teachers are always managing the learning process. They're there with you all the time. What are some of the challenges when adapting that to what you do and what I do as well, which is basically self-study, where the students are learning by themselves without that live feedback from a teacher? What are some of the things that you have to take into account in order to make that work?
Yeah, so when you have a live teacher, the teacher can look at your face and see if you're not understanding something, and explain it again, explain it with different words, or draw something and make you understand. But of course, when you're using video, there's no way of doing that. And instead, that shifts onto the student. So instead of being the teacher who makes things comprehensible for you, you have to try to build a platform or build a pool of content where it's very easy for the students to pick and choose things that are easy for them to understand. I think it's mostly about that, about structuring, about making it very discoverable, making it easy for students to know which things are at their level and what they should be listening to next.
Okay, so you have a more kind of choose your own adventure type model, do you?
Yes, and I've opened a website recently with all the content on the channel, and as a way of also making it easier for people to browse through all the content. But we're thinking of building a bit more structure into it so that there's more of a timeline that people can follow and they're a bit more guided, especially at the very beginning where there's not that many things that you're gonna understand yet. I think there's some value, and we want to test having a bit of a more guided experience.
Yeah, that certainly is a challenge, because we both teach through comprehensible input in different forms, and I think for anyone who's got prior experience learning a language, and is used to studying grammar rules, memorizing vocabulary, I mean, if there is a benefit to that traditional study, it is the fact that it's quite easy to track your progress. You can say, okay, I've memorized 10 words today and I've passed my grammar test. It gives you...
Exactly, it's very easy to test. And I think that's one of the main reasons why it's continued for so long, is that it makes it very easy for teachers everywhere to score you.
Yeah, exactly. But it also does have the perceived benefit for the learners of making micro steps forward and making some kind of progress. Whereas that's a lot more challenging to demonstrate with comprehensible input based approach.
Yes, you cannot make a list of, today I learned these 10 words.
Yeah, or at the very least, I mean, you can pull words out of it, but but we're trying to avoid that really, because we're this ethos is much more to suggest that, look, just keep this up, trust in the process, and by spending all of this time with all of this input, you'll just get this rising tide effect where all boats are lifted. I've thought a lot about how to deal with that, and my way of teaching is through stories. And in my courses, I actually began at the very beginning having a much more open approach, but I ended up creating quite a structured program, which is very much like, do this first, now do this, now do this, now do this, because I knew that the big risk was that there would be a certain number of people who would bail out before they'd really understood the process. So we've got to manage that, and I think that's one of the challenges for us as teachers, which is unique to our own situation of teaching online and not live, right? Because if you are face-to-face, you can just do so much more live management of the learning. Yeah,
in terms of educating them and setting expectations for them.
What do you think comprehensible input by itself is enough, or is there what else is needed?
This is science. It's shown in plenty of case studies that comprehensible input is sufficient to acquire a language. Yeah, this is something that I'm convinced of because I've experienced it myself with Japanese and with Thai, and now I can speak Thai. I can understand TV shows. I talk every day with my wife in Thai, and the only thing I've never used a textbook. I've never used a translator like Google Translate or something, and it's worked for me. So I don't have any doubts about that.
The evidence of this, like you said, the evidence of this is there for all. It's plain for all to see. I've released videos on my channel where I break down the method that very successful language learners have used, and I mean the one that springs to mind most of all is Matt versus Japan, who has reached a near native level of Japanese solely through input. That was a perfect example of how just huge amounts of input, and in his case not always comprehensible either, sometimes way above his head, but whatever input, there's just huge amounts of evidence that works. The trouble is that I suspect that you need to have a certain amount, a base level of motivation and perseverance for in order to make this work, because most people they're not as insane as we are in terms of really going after languages. So I agree with you that there is no better way to learn languages, because on the extreme end you're kind of talking about, okay, well, let's say I drop you in a village in Thailand for 2 years. You're going to speak Thai by the end of it. There is no faster way to learn, right? But then that is not a practical solution for many people. So then from there, you have to kind of row back many steps. I mean, the most extreme of which then is you end up in a language classroom in the US or something, where you have the opposite of an immersion environment. So I think we have to, again, like another one of the challenges that we as educators have is to figure out, okay, we know the ideal, we know the theory, we know comprehensible input can be the holy grail, but we've still got to bridge the gap between the ideal and the reality for many people.
Sure. I mean, there's always the practicality of people's lives and what they can do at any time and motivation. And as you said, language courses can be motivating at the beginning because you go there every day and you feel like you've learned 2 grammar points and a certain amount of vocabulary, right? But then it depends what your goal is, because if your goal is to travel to the country and being able to use certain sentences to just say some basic things, then probably you're better off just remembering the sentences by heart and just saying them, and then you're not going to understand the answer, but what did you expect? You just study for a few hours. But if your goal is to eventually get to speak with fluency, I'm not sure that the traditional method is more likely to succeed, because I think one thing that happens when you use the traditional method is the plateau, the mythical plateau. And I think this is a consequence of studying, not acquiring, right? Because when you go to a classroom, you study the grammar. There's only a certain amount of grammar rules, of simple grammar rules. And when you're done with that, then you have a lot more vocabulary. You have to learn many expressions all the little details of grammar that are not explicitly stated in the rules, but that people really use. And then people feel like they're at the intermediate level, but now it's very hard to make progress. If you go the acquisition way, you're used to that because that's your bread and your butter. That's what you've been doing since the beginning. You've just been little by little adding a little bit, and then your expectations are set already to that. So yes, in the short term, maybe traditional language learning can be a bit more motivating, but we will have to see, we'll have to do long-term studies and see, having two groups of people, how many people in each group would get to fluency in the language, right?
Yeah, well, that's another big question, right? How far, to what extent is it actually possible to study this stuff? Because it seems to me that in language learning, every individual's unique life circumstances have so much more of an impact on their success than anything else. Because if you've got a screaming kid in the other room when you're trying to study, it complicates things. And then if you're able to go and do an immersion course in Thailand on the other extreme, it's fantastic. Pablo, it's been great to talk. Thanks so much for the time. So for everyone watching, if you'd like to see the continuation of this talk in Spanish over on Pablo's channel, we put the link below. And then lastly, Pablo, where can people find you online?
So yeah, mostly just go to YouTube, look for Dreaming Spanish, and we have more than 500 videos that are public on YouTube, and then we have private videos that you can subscribe to and watch on our website that will keep track of all the amount of hours that you've watched in the language and track how much progress you've made towards your goal of listening to, as many hours of comprehensible input as you need to reach your goals.
Fantastic, wonderful resource. So thank you for all that work that you do. That's a really great contribution. So okay, thanks, man, and we'll talk soon.
Okay, bye, Ollie.